Let's go on a journey together. We're going to journey through the last 81 years of political economy to explain A, this global chaos in which we find ourselves right now, and B, how crypto and Cardano fit into the picture. So grab your beach themed battle axes and let's go. If the only tsunami of dollars you want to see is the one resulting from your bags pumping, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies DRep address and the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Okay, guys, this is going to be a little bit complicated and it's going to take a second, but it's not going to be boring. This is not going to be boring. Do not turn off the video. This won't be boring. I'm going to keep it nice and light. We're going to move along crisply. It's going to be non-boring, but it is going to take a second. The short version, though, if you want the TLDR, the short version is that this is either the best win-win ever for the US economically or the catalyst of a global depression that also possibly triggers hot wars. So I think we're all hoping for the first one. And if you're not in the US, you're hoping that it's also somehow great for your jurisdiction. But either way, regardless of where you are and which ends of the spectrum we end up on, hopefully it's not the hot wars and global depression, but whichever end of the spectrum we end up on and wherever you are, I think crypto is a pretty special place to be right now. And we're going to talk about all of that. Okay, guys, we are going to go back in time 81 years to 1944 to this location right here. You see in this picture, we have a very, ideal looking grassy field, some mountains in the background, and this old hotel. This old hotel is what we care about here because this was the location of the Bretton Woods Conference, which was the founding of the Bretton Woods system. So the Bretton Woods system. This was founded toward the end of World War II when everybody knew that everyone but the US was broke and most of Europe was completely depopulated of males. This was a problem globally. This was a problem because the US and everybody else knew we were going to want to do that most human of things, commerce, once the war was over. And the war was winding down. It was 1944. But the US knew it was going to need one thing from the rest of the world. The US was going to need global security coordination to combat what at times we've called the Red Menace. This is the expansion of communism. The expansion of communism. As the Allies marched east into Germany, the Russians, not even the Russians, the Soviet army was marching west also into Germany. And the world would be divided basically between this Western capitalist democratic system and the Soviet system. The people in the West, the people who were part of the Western system, didn't want the Soviet system to envelop the whole world. They were anti-commie. They didn't like the communists. They were afraid of the Red Menace. And the US was no less afraid than anyone else. The US made a deal with the world, the non-commie world. That deal was, let us control your global security and we will patrol the world's shipping lanes so that we can all do commerce globally. If we can strike that bargain, we'll also guarantee your security. Each of you, individual nation states who are a part of the non-commie world. Also, we'll give you a good deal on trade, and eventually, we'll even turn a blind eye to you tariffing our trade a little bit, while we probably won't tariff you because we believe in free trade. So, this was the bargain that the US was making at the founding of this Bretton Woods system. Why? Because we largely weren't involved in the early days of World War II. Our populations and our industrial infrastructure weren't ravaged by World War II. We came in kind of late to the game and we were just sort of there for the part where we clinched victory. Okay. We lost a huge number of soldiers. We stormed the beaches of Normandy. I'll let all of you history buffs debate, the contributions of various nations to the defeat of Nazi Germany. That's not what this video is about. But what it is about is what happened at Bretton Woods and after. And that was this deal being struck. The US was effectively bribing everyone with a favorable global trading environment. And in return, everyone in the free world was going to let the US run global security policy. This sounds too incredible, right? The whole world was going to let the US run global security policy. But that's basically exactly what happened. This turned the US into the world police, but it also ushered in an era of hitherto unknown prosperity globally. So like I said, it sounds too incredible. Why would any nation agree to let the US run global security policy? Because everybody was making money. The quality of life of people in a lot of different parts of the world started improving after World War II. And in Europe, everything had been destroyed. It was the second of two extremely destructive wars where a whole generation of men were consumed by a war. So Europe had been destroyed. And the rest of the world, they were happy to join on to something that sounded better than what they had seen in the past. And that better thing was this global system of commerce. So things things progressed on that front. We had a few hot regional wars where the Western allies, mainly the US, but with a lot of contributions from the US's allies, wanted to push back on Soviet expansion, communist expansion, whether it came in the form of hot wars in Asia or other wars elsewhere. So we did push back with hot kinetic wars in a few places around the world. Okay, maybe a lot of places all over Asia and Latin America, maybe a lot of places, there were some hot regional wars. There was no direct kinetic warfare between the superpowers. By that, I mean the nuclear powers. We never ended up in a kinetic war with the Soviet Union or with China because they had nukes and we didn't want to burn the whole world down. We wanted the human race to continue. So this went on and we were in the Cold War. Then Reagan got up and did his whole Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall thing. And eventually the wall did fall and the Soviet Union crumbled. Was this because Reagan gave that speech? Not at all. It was because command economies don't work the way the Soviet Union was doing it. They were the famous example that you get in super basic economics classes is that they had factories in far off regions making boots for the entire system, and the people getting the orders about how many boots to make weren't responding to market indicators, market stimulus, or market forces at all. You just had the central planners deciding how many boots were being made, and they were going to make far too many or far too few. We won't get into all the reasons that the Soviet Union crumbled. You can take whole classes on that in universities and encounter all kinds of people who are full on communists who wish it had never fallen, and others who are just glad they survived the Cold War. But the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is no more. So the wall did fall. Soviet Union did crumble. And the so-called Red Menace only meaningfully existed at that point in China and North Korea. And it lingered in a lot of other, less meaningful places. Cuba, we won't get into all of the communist or semi-communist small states around the world. North Korea, though, was a hermit kingdom, and China had already decided to become the world's factory, which required cooperation with the Western capitalist democracies it was selling its goods to. China couldn't exactly be exporting straight up Maoist style communism anymore to the rest of Asia if it wanted the US to buy its goods. So we had also made a deal of sorts with China. So things were fairly stable. China wasn't, doing things that would result in hot wars with proxies where the US was going to be sending troops to Asia. We weren't in fear of any kind of hot or kinetic war with Russia. things were pretty stable. At this point, you might argue, okay, the threat of communist expansion is under control. Why would the US continue giving everyone such a good deal and letting all the other parties free ride on the US patrolling all of the world's shipping lanes? Well, the US needed a lot of TVs and VCRs and Toyota Camrys from Asia and petroleum from the Gulf states, and it had the world's biggest navy just sitting there anyway, so it was going to keep patrolling the seas. Also, the US needed to keep an eye on our old adversary Russia to see what problems it would cause once someone picked up the pieces and started rebuilding. So the old system, this Bretton Woods system, even after the Cold War ended, the old system was left in place in the 90s. The Cold War had ended in the 80s, and by the late 90s, this old Bretton Woods system was still in place because it kind of worked for everyone. By the year 2000, the Y2K bug didn't send us all back to medieval times. The Russian Federation was too mired in kleptocracy to have caused any huge problems directly for the West, and China was too reliant on exports to the West to invade Taiwan or cause any other huge expansionist problems. So at this point, the few remaining reasons to keep the old system in place were seemingly more and more distant relics of the past. So at this point, you might argue the US would finally abandon the global deal that started at Bretton Woods. Nope. 9/11 happened and we got the GWAT instead. So we we thought at that point everything was good. The Cold War had basically been won. The whole world seemed, as secure as it had been in a long time. And nope, 9/11, GWAT, US invades Afghanistan. And then just for the hell of it, somehow we also end up in a simultaneous war in a second theater in Iraq, all over some kind of yellow cake. I think we're all pretty mad at whatever bakery made that yellow cake at this point. I don't mean to make light of that war. A lot of people died. A huge number of Iraqis died in that war. So I don't mean to make light of it, but I think we would all prefer it if we had never heard the words yellow cake. And I'm sure that intelligence came from somewhere, but man, I sure wish that war had never happened. And I wish this war had been about 6 months long. I wish we could have gotten in there, gotten Osama bin Laden in like 6 months and gotten the hell out of there. Instead, we got the GWAT, the global war on terror, and it was going to last forever. In fact, it just barely ended. The GWAT was basically a multi-decade, 20-year war that took a lot of lives, an incredible amount of money, an incredible amount of security cooperation, and I wish I could say more than that in this video, but we all lived through it. We all know what that was. So the GWAT happens. The US would simultaneously fight unwinnable wars in two different theaters. That's a whole discussion for another episode, and the US would need global security cooperation once again, but with good trade deals for everyone and a stable global trading environment. Then it was 2025. Now it's 2025, and the GWAT was over. The Americans were tired of war and conflict. They were tired of paying for a giant navy to patrol oil shipping lanes for oil they didn't need now with fracking in North America. They were tired of footing such a huge bill for NATO. They were tired of sending dollars to China for cheap manufactured goods when those same dollars would only build amphibious vehicles and missiles aimed at an eventual invasion of Taiwan and all of its microprocessor producing capabilities. They were tired of espousing global free trade when even their own allies tariffed US goods. The next generation of Americans in many states could no longer in 2025 afford homes. The whole world had gotten richer, but the middle class in the US had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. The average young person had to work twice as hard as his grandfather to afford a quality of life that was half as good. The $15,000 house in the suburbs on a $5,000 salary was now a $950,000 house in the suburbs on a $60,000 salary, if you're a little lucky. The average person making a little bit less than that even. The white picket fence with a promising job, a spouse, children, 2 cars, steak dinners, and 1 vacation a year had somehow been traded along the way for a basement studio apartment, Netflix, the perusing of hubs of different sorts, seed oils, an Xbox, and a punishing 9 to 5 where the only route to survival is constant self-censorship to match a maze of newly invented vocabulary. So that's where we find ourselves today. That's how we ended up with a second Trump term. And that's how we jurisdictions. This could be the point where they jump into a sort of trade alliance of sorts with the biggest, currently still, the biggest economy on earth, or they decide to go a different path. So it looks like this could be it could be something very pivotal for a lot of different countries in the world, or maybe it's not. We'll talk about that. The whole spectrum of possibilities is on the table, but that means there's also the whole spectrum of bad possibilities. Will this cause an acceleration in the conflict between Chairman Ryan, that's Xi Jinping, and the Red Princelings in China that leads to a premature invasion of Taiwan? Did we jump the gun on this whole tariff thing? Did we provoke China at the wrong time? If you haven't been following what's going on with PLA and Xi Jinping and the Red Princelings, and how the decision whether or not to attempt to invade Taiwan is tied up in all that, you might want to catch up on all of that. Should we have built out our manufacturing infrastructure in Mexico and Southeast Asia before drawing the gun on a trade war with China? Would that have even ever really been possible, given that it took 40 years to build out the manufacturing capabilities in China? Can Europe stand on its own against a Putinified Russia bound and determined to return to at least some of its prior borders that would consume at least Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, Moldova, and Romania? Do we even want the remilitarized Germany that would be required for Europe to repel such Russian ambitions? A lot of unanswered questions here that probably won't even all be answered this decade. That's if this whole thing goes badly. The one thing I will venture to guess is that Trump probably hasn't truly game planned at any detailed level any of those second order consequences. He just did what he always does. He made some threats, and then when the world didn't respect his authority, he just knocked over that first domino to wait until they did respect his ability to change the world order. Let them suffer if they don't get on board. You could call this reckless or crazy, and you would probably be right. There's some extreme risk taking going on here and some acceptance of collateral damage. Look no further than the year to date US equities markets earlier today, with Apple stock down 31%, the Nasdaq down 21%, and the S&P down 15% for a taste of the carnage. But this part Trump probably did expect. He's early in his term. This is his second term. He's early in the term. And he was elected by all the people working twice as hard as their grandparents for half the quality of life. He wasn't elected by all the people with giant stock portfolios and full fridges. He wasn't elected by the people holding all the Apple stock. He was elected by people with no stake in this current system and no chance of buying a home. They don't have those assets. The assets that are suffering right now, something like 80% of them are owned. 80% of those assets are owned by something like the top 5 or 10% of people. Only the top 5 or 10% of people own the vast majority of all these assets that are suffering today. The rest of the people don't have the kinds of assets that are bleeding so much right now. His constituents, Trump's constituents, voted for a fourth turning because they never got any of the previous plunder. They voted for this. The rich are suffering today. They voted for that. Will they actually get what they voted for, though? An upturning of the status quo? Probably not. He does seem to be fulfilling his campaign promise to them, but he's also doing what he always does. He made the big threat. Then he tipped over the first domino, and now he waits for everyone to come to the negotiating table. He doesn't want a new world order. He wants what he always wants, for everyone to kiss the ring while he wins the negotiation. That's his end game. He doesn't want for the US to break off trade relations with China so that the world can't have cheap iPhones and laptops for the next 10 years, while we maybe end up in a kinetic war with a fellow superpower over Taiwan's semiconductors. He just decided to take the big risk and jump off the cliff so that he would land in a king-making negotiating position or die trying. That's who this guy is. We knew that. We've already had him for 4 years. Everybody knew that. He didn't declare all those bankruptcies along the way because he was risk averse. He's not the managing details guy. He's the all or nothing, jump off the cliff, collateral damage be damned guy, win everything or be destroyed guy. And that's what his constituents voted for. They don't care that the stock market is bleeding because they don't own those stocks. They voted for somebody who would put them first. And it's hard not to understand why, because the working people were never really put first, or at least they haven't been put first for a very long time. So it's understandable that they don't care that the price of Apple stock is all messed up today, because they've never owned Apple stock. They don't own Apple stock today, and they're not going to own Apple stock at any point in their lives. So, where does this leave all of us? Well, the US mark. Oh, and by the way, I'm not saying that only working class people voted for Trump. Obviously, a lot of CEOs also voted for Trump. A lot of very rich people also voted for Trump. But I would say a very large group of his constituents are these working class people who don't care about the price of risk assets, because those haven't ever been assets for them. And it's kind of understandable that they don't care. So, where does this leave us, though? Well, the US markets have always kind of looked like this. We have this big cycle. And I shouldn't say always, I should say since the global financial crisis, it's looked like this. And of course, we've talked a lot on this channel about Austrian economics and von Mises and Hayek and all those things. That's not what we've been doing since the global financial crisis. I think we've discussed that ad nauseum on this channel, but that's not what we've been doing. We haven't been doing anything that remotely resembles Austrian economics. What we've been doing instead is something that looks more like this, at least to me. People would use different vocabulary to describe these things, but this is what it's looked like to me. We have this crazy party time where assets go crazy. All the risk assets go crazy, equities, tech stocks, they all go to the moon, crypto included. It's party time, assets go crazy. Then everybody realizes we went a little too crazy. Financial conditions tighten. Who notices it when financial conditions tighten? Pretty much just Wall Street, the very sophisticated, the people who are actually paying attention to what's going on notice that financial conditions have tightened. Who doesn't notice? Retail. Retail only notices when the Fed increases the interest rate. Retail notices when the owl, Jerome Powell, gets up on stage and he says, things are too crazy, interest rate up. Then retail notices. At some point, at about this stage, it's always the time when we need to roll over the US debt. As everyone in the world has been talking about, seems like for the last 20 years and even before that, the US runs at a deficit. We're always in debt, and the debt just gets bigger and bigger every single year. And the way we fix that is we just do this Ponzi scheme like thing where we take on new lenders who will lend us more money to pay off the old lenders, and we just roll this debt right over. Perfectly legal. We do it all the time. You can't do it. I can't do it. But The US government can do it, and a lot of other governments do it. This is what we do. So, right about the time it's time to roll over the debt, we also often have some kind of a crisis. It's war in the Middle East. It's saber rattling over Taiwan. It's Russia invading some neighboring country on its borders. It's a lab incident in Wuhan. It's tariffs, etc. Whatever it is, there's some kind of a crisis. There's some kind of a crisis when it's time to roll the debts over. And that's when we get financial conditions easing. Not because we need to roll the debts over, mind you. It's because of the crisis. It's always the crisis. It's not because we need to roll the debts over. And we don't want to, if you're the borrower, you don't want to roll the debts over at a high price. You want to roll the debts over at a low price. So we have the crisis, and then financial conditions ease. Wall Street notices. Again, retail doesn't pay attention to that, but Wall Street notices. And then the Fed finally lowers the interest rate. That's what the retail sees. Retail notices that, and we're back to party time. This is how the cycle works. Party time, conditions tighten, Fed raises rates. Rates are too high. Now we need to roll the debt back. Miraculously, a crisis happens. And then financial conditions ease, the Fed lowers rates, retail sees, and we're back to party time. If this looks a lot like that whole meme, hard times make hard men make good times make weak men make hard times make good men. If this seems familiar, if this seems similar to that meme, it's because it's exactly the same thing. It's just our financial markets doing exactly that thing. And by the way, I'm not saying that some evil globalist cabal of individuals are manufacturing these crises. I know some of you would say that, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying the conditions of the system lend themselves to these crises happening at that point in the cycle. It's like the system is primed for this kind of thing to happen. And when it does, it helps move the cycle forward. Not that that's a good thing, but that's what seems to happen. So, minus the events at hand, retail right now would just be waiting for the June Fed meeting, the FOMC meeting, where they would be hoping for a cut in rates. The more sophisticated already know that financial conditions have already eased, and they would just be waiting for the Fed to signal to the masses that it's party time. But we have additional events going on right now. So, this normal kind of cycle of party time and then all of the financial condition and Fed rate adjustments, eventually leading back to another party time. That cycle existing normally doesn't mean that Trump won't massively foobar everything in the meantime. His economic chaos might accelerate the struggle between the PLA and the Red Princelings and Chairman Ryan and cause an early showdown over Taiwan. His lack of enthusiasm, downright contempt for US membership in NATO could cause Putin to take even wilder risks and cross into territory belonging to a NATO ally like Poland. His tiptoeing towards strategic strikes against cartel targets in Mexico could spiral out of control and tip that country into chaos until we have to intervene across our own border. Most immediately and separate from the tariffs, the negotiations with Iran could go all wrong until we end up in direct kinetic conflict with a power that could go nuclear any day. So there's a lot of risk in the system right now that could dwarf how the tariffs are currently affecting the markets. Those are the individual bad possible outcomes. The more generalized bad possible outcomes would be that the global order started at Bretton Woods completely breaks down, with the world devolving into smaller trade alliances. The US would likely trade with the Five Eyes nations, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Taiwan if it's still independent somehow, and whoever else we let join up from Southeast Asia and Latin America. Then China would have its own group of trade partners as it continues down its demographic spiral. And Europe would be its own little trade alliance. Turkey, Iran, and the Gulf states would all vie for varying levels of influence over the Middle East. Russia would just continue its horrific demographic decline, while what was already an economy only the size of something like Spain, some nation like that, would just continue to decline. The world also probably returns to its pre-Bretton Woods condition of near continuous regional wars. But like I said, I don't think Trump really wants to burn it all down and deliver a fourth turning dystopia to his constituents. He just wants everyone to kiss the ring while he wins all the negotiations. So hopefully this is like every other crisis over the last few years, and it just sort of goes down like this. Like this thing. Hopefully, we just come back to this. Hopefully, it's just another one of these crises that fit into the cycle right here. And then we just kind of go back into this thing and we end up at party time again. I think that's what everybody in crypto is hoping, that this is just Trump being a very hard-nosed negotiator slash being a bully, depending on what part of the political spectrum you're on. Hopefully, this is just him doing his thing where he comes out guns blazing, takes the most extreme position in the most extreme possible condition in the negotiation, so that anything he gives to the other side is, seems refreshing because his original position was so extreme. Hopefully he's just doing that thing and we can end up at a negotiated settlement with all the nations of the world. I guess we're doing all the nations of the world. Hopefully we negotiate. Hopefully he just negotiates something with all the nations of the world, and it just ends up being another one of these temporary crises that eventually lead us back down this path to what crypto would love: party time. So, what does all this actually mean for crypto? Well, no matter what, confidence in the Bretton Woods global system and even in NATO has been shaken to the core. Everyone got to walk up to the abyss and see that it's real easy for all of us to end up in a post global world. That is a virus that won't be fully cleared by the global immune system. Everyone knows it might be coming now. Maybe not this year, maybe not even this decade, but it could be coming. Obviously, the dollar is not going to be a globally hegemonic unit of trade in any environment where the world is divided up into a half dozen major trade alliances. So, a common unit of trade would be required. It would have to be a unit of trade not controlled by any one state. In fact, even better, it's verifiably not controlled by anyone. You can see where this is going. Crypto is the obvious choice for a common unit of trade across trade alliances. So while it may not happen yet, a world that makes crypto crucial will be on everybody's mind from here on out. As always, Cardano being the most decentralized and the best negotiation of the three legs of the blockchain trilemma will be very attractive in that scenario, especially adding its capabilities as a smart contract layer for Bitcoin. Smart contracts seem tailor-made for trade between trade alliances where there is no common agreement as to law, and after all, Bitcoin is still the most widely known decentralized store of value. For my part, I hope none of this happens. Obviously, I don't want any of this to happen. I like this environment where the entire world can trade with each other. I like access to Asian electronics, European wines and whiskeys, Polynesian kavas, and Irish butter. I like my passport giving me easy access globally. So fingers crossed, none of this goes away. But if it does one day, Cardano will be ready for that too. In the meantime, I hope it's just this. I hope it's this cycle. I hope this is just a temporary crisis. If it's this, we do have to ask one very important question, though. Is this whole tariffs flap, is this going to screw up year 4 of the crypto cycle? This is probably one of the most important questions if you're one of those crypto people. I know a lot of you are, who've been DCAing into Cardano for some time. If you're like me and you've been DCAing into Cardano for a very long time, this is probably one of the most important questions. There are a lot of moral questions and sort of like human questions about how this is going to affect the whole world. But for your own personal financial situation, one of the biggest questions is this going to screw up year 4 of the crypto cycle? Can we get rate cuts in June and still live out the crypto cycle fantasies that have kept our hopes alive for the last 4 years? The answer is maybe, maybe not. Nobody really knows. I don't know. You don't know. Nobody really knows. A lot of people are going to be on social media, including YouTube, telling you that they know. Nobody really knows. We're in uncharted territory here with these tariffs. It's also possible that the tariffs have already caused so much disruption and that the negotiations will take so long that it pushes everything into next year instead of finishing up in December, as a lot of people are kind of expecting, since this is year 4 of the 4-year cycle. It is encouraging that the White House is saying 70 different nation states have already called them up, and that a lot of them are already starting the negotiation process. There's been mention of Japan and South Korea. No surprise there. But it's also no surprise that 70 different nation states would call. This is like the biggest global economic thing that's happened in a long, long time. So, of course, they're going to pick up the phone and make the phone call. So, we've got South Korea, Japan, and a handful of others that are already dealing with the White House. Apparently, 70 different phone calls, but a handful already starting this negotiation process. I guess the White House claims, according to interviews with Scott Bessent and others, sounds like the White House is prioritizing certain countries and talking with them first. And a lot of other countries are already saying they're happy to reset all of their tariffs to zero. But of course, if you've been following this news, there's a big difference between what the White House considers impediments to US companies selling goods and services in those countries and just tariffs. They think of the tariffs as just one component, and a lot of other things creating impediments to free trade as also being part of these, tariffs writ large that needs to go away. So even the countries that are just saying now, hey, we'll take our tariffs to zero, even that's not going to be enough if they have these other types of impediments to US companies selling into those countries. I'm personally hoping this is just a very dramatic version of the crisis that happens in this cycle we're looking at right here. I'm hoping this is just the Orange Man version of this, where everything has to be as high drama as possible. This is how he likes to negotiate. And let's face it, the dude is probably a pretty scary negotiator. If you're some small, manufacturing nation having to deal with Trump on the other side, you're probably going to approach that very differently than if you have a dementia ravaged non executive as the executive. Instead, you've got the orange man there, and the orange man, not exactly known as a kind negotiator. Hopefully, this is what we get. Hopefully, it's not that whole the whole globe diving into the abyss thing. Update, guys. We've got an important update. So, about 12 hours after this episode was recorded, the Orange Man came out with this. He says, hey, still mad at China, actually upping the tariffs to 125%, effective immediately. Why? Because China was not doing all the things we said, kissing the ring, letting Trump win the negotiation, all those things. They're basically just retaliating. But that's not what the other 70, originally, we were hearing 70. In this post, he's saying 75 countries have done. Those countries did call up the United States and they want to negotiate. So Trump decided to announce in this post that he was authorizing a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, during which all the reciprocal tariffs would go down to 10%. And this had the effect on the markets that you would expect. So look at this. Dow up almost 8%, S&P up 9.5%, NASDAQ up over 12%. This is crazy. And if we come down here and we look at Apple, who does, famously does has a ton of their manufacturing done in China. Even Apple up 15%, Palantir 19%, Tesla 22, Intel 18 and three quarters. Nvidia almost 18 and three quarters. So obviously, all of the risk assets are booming. Had a similar effect in the crypto markets, as all of you already know. This is pretty much the good version. This is the version of the story we talked about, where this is just the crisis of the cycle. This is just that crisis of the cycle that comes along, and then the Fed has to come out and eventually drop rates. And this is the one for this cycle. Obviously, nobody knows what the Fed is actually going to do, how many rate cuts we get, how big the rate cuts will be, when the rate cuts will happen. Nobody really knows the answer to that question. You can find all kinds of speculation every single day all over the internet on those exact questions. We don't really know, but what we do know is that so far this is kind of fitting that same pattern. But we're also dealing with an orange man administration, which means just like things changed drastically today, and I had to make this update to this episode, things could change drastically tomorrow. Tomorrow we could be right back to the same position if things start disintegrating, if things start deteriorating, if things get worse with China, things could change again tomorrow. So I think what I said in the rest of this episode still holds true. We're probably all hoping that this is just a very dramatic version of that normal cycle, that normal 4-year cycle we go through, and that it's just a little bit more dramatic because of the way the administration in the White House negotiates. That's the good version, but nobody really knows what's going to happen. Things could disintegrate and we could still get that other version. But so far, things are looking pretty promising. I mean, this looks a lot better than what we were looking at yesterday. In Cardano proper news, the biggest thing going on is still the budget. But I'm proud to say I think we have some progress going on here. So here is the 2025 IO engineering core development proposal. So this isn't like a full budget for everything in Cardano. This is IO saying, hey guys, we've still got some core development to complete, and here's the budget that we think will work for core development. And as I go through this proposal, I see a lot of things I like. Scale. They want to solve scalability limitations, node architecture and performance, smart contract assurance and developer experience, improve Plinth, Aiken, Plutarch, SPO viability and security, user experience and adoption barriers, ecosystem competitiveness, core maintenance and knowledge transfer. All those things sound really good to me. For the ecosystem, deliver massive L1 throughput increase, Laos, robust L2 scaling, Hydra and Mithril, and position Cardano competitively in new areas like AVS, Minotaur. Uh, Knowledge sharing and modular architecture, Acropolis, nested transactions, Babel fees, tiered pricing, Hydra. These are all things. Plutus High Assurance Suite, Plutus Core enhancements, uh, for stake pool operators, significant reduced node operation costs. All these things sound fantastic. What have we got here? Here's another sort of repeat of the proposed transactions along with dollar figures. Here's the best part of all this. They only want 48 million. 48 million to give us all of these things. Laos, Mithril, Minotaur, Hydra, Acropolis, uh, Plutus enhancements, all of these things in the proposal. I haven't looked really closely at this. It just barely came out yesterday, but this looks like a pretty easy decision to me. I think I want Ouroboros Laos. I think I want Babel fees. I think I want enhancements to Plutus. I think I want enhancements to the SPO environment. I think all of these things sound great. And this is one of the smallest budgets we've seen. Granted, this isn't for the entire ecosystem. This isn't everything. Look, there's even more. There's even more down here. Ouroboros Paris, Ouroboros Laos. Is basically everything we've talked about on this channel ever in the development of Cardano. They're saying, hey, here's what we need for 2025 to push all these things along. 48 million. This a lot of people on X have been calling this, a lot of other DReps have been calling this a no-brainer. I haven't looked through every single word of this. I'm going to read this more closely, but I got to agree. This looks like a no-brainer. Again, always open to hear everybody's input on all of these types of things. I'll always vote my own mind and what I think is the right thing. But of course, I'd love if anybody has any strong opinions. I'd love to hear the opinions on this. But as I go through this right now, this looks like a pretty easy decision to me. And honestly, this is a relief. You might remember, I think it was the very most recent video, the last video. You might remember me asking for a minimum viable budget. A minimum viable budget just to make sure we could check off these things, exactly these things here. Check off these things, make sure that these we're moving forward on these things. Make sure these things, these very important core things, it's right in the name, core. These are the core items. I know it's like development, it's core development on the blockchain, but they're also conceptually the core items. I want to make sure we get done. So I'm very relieved that somebody came up with a minimum viable budget. That's what this is, a minimum viable budget to make sure these things got done while we're fighting over all the other stuff. And we do need to fight over all the other stuff. I use the word fight playfully here. Of course, we don't really want to fight, but we need to hash out, all the different interests and preferences. We need to hash all those things out. While we're doing that, let's get IO going on these things. So thank you very much, Input Output, for putting together a minimum viable budget. This is exactly what I was hoping for. I'm relieved. For sure, this is not going to be a boring year. This is going to be an exciting year in crypto and in the world. I'm glad to be around for this wild ride, and I hope you are too. Hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.